Hey, it's Mazzy, and I'm going to just beat a dead horse here because I'm going to talk about these Beatle Capitol records. Now, I've been sick for the last week plus with the major flu. It wasn't COVID, and it knocked me out. And a combination of videos, I've seen the headlines, haven't watched any of them because I decided I didn't want to watch them, but reading the forums about this. And there's a lot of Beatle people. Beatle people, like, as I said before, Dylan people, Springsteen people, a few other bands, are crazy. They're crazy. We want this. We don't want that. Don't speak in the collective, okay? If you want something or don't want something, that's your business. But don't speak about we. Now, of course, the Capitol records are important. I mean, I would guess, and it's not a hard guess at all, that the Beatles sold more of those Capitol records in the 1960s than any other version, than the original versions, the EMI Parlophone versions, the way they meant them to be. I'm sure of it. It conquered America. And Capitol Records, Dave Dexter, who didn't initially want the Beatles, took these stereo tapes, did fold downs for the mono, added compression to some of them, remixed a couple of songs, added reverb to some of them, reconfigured the album. They basically made them so the American appetite, so Americans could digest them easier. If you listen to AM radio back in the 1960s, there was reverb all over the radio. In fact, local stations would add reverb to songs to make them more fun on the radio, and what they call fun. Now, to this day, if you have nice stereos, it's a whole different world out there. But it wasn't unusual, and we didn't bitch about it. We loved those records. So I'm talking about the collective we, because people are saying, we don't want these. We want Rubber Soul remix. We don't want anything. I don't want anything remixed. Who needs to remix anything? Maybe the early years, I can understand that, and what they did with the Red album last year because of the separation. But this whole thing of we, they put things out there, and I am tentatively interested in this set. There are plenty other videos that are going to tell you all the details about it. Now, let me just go back to the CD era a little bit. I'm just ranting because I'm still, getting over the fever, man. Capitol put these out, and these are actually, aside from this shit-ass packaging, whoever designed these must have been a blind person. No offense to blind people. These were terrible designed sets. However, the content was actually really good. They used the Capitol mixes. They used the sound of those tapes, the Dave Dexter, the reverb drenched, I Feel Fine, the extra harmonic, all the stuff that you can listen to and figure out in other places. I'm not going to get in the details of that because I don't remember all the details like that. And so it doesn't really matter. This is more of a personal take on this. So these were actually pretty good, except for the fact they stopped. They never did Yesterday and Today, and there would have been one more volume. And what a terrible ass volume. Now, what year was this? Was this 10 years ago already? I don't even remember. This could have been great. This Japanese type mini sleeves, the Beatles, the way American intended the Beatles to be. Of course, what I love is A Hard Day's Night and Help soundtrack. They're soundtracks. They're not Beatle records per se. They're soundtracks. You have incidental music. Arguably, Rubber Soul is the best American version of a Beatle album that in a way improves it. And I would give an argument for the Beatles' second album. But of course, a lot of people really like this. Of course, there's your the great rock and roll, their best rock and roll record ever. Of course, the Beatles, and it had a book and all the other stuff. Of course, you get the Beatles story in here, which is very controversial now in terms of everything else. But you got Yesterday and Today with the Butcher cover. But you have both. So you have the Slick, I believe that's the Slick, what is it, about this. But the problem with this set, they totally fucked the ball on this set, is they used the EMI Beatles mixes. Why bother putting configurations of the Capitol records just to use the EMI mixes. Yes, that's the way the Beatles intended. Yes, that's the way they wanted it. You know, this whole thing about artist intent. But if you're going to do this, do it right. And they totally, you know, jumped it on that. My experience again is, you know, 9.5 years old, the Beatles come and I get those records. And we're talking about this box set coming out now. Just briefly, the monos were from stereo fold downs to mono. I'm not going to get all in the details of this, but this is probably one of the greatest records ever put out anywhere in the world. It's just it runs great. Now, also in those days, you know, the Americans put out 12 tracks opposed to 14 tracks, partially because in America, they could put out 3 albums for every 2 albums the Beatles actually made. Partly because of publishing, you would pay by song. I think it was different in the UK. So if you had 14 tracks, you had to pay more publishing than 12 tracks. So it is definitely a way of making money back then and making more money for the label. And also in the UK, the Beatles thought about value for their fans in the UK, and they didn't put singles on albums. I don't remember anyone ever bitching in America when they were 10, 11, 12 years old that a hit single was on a Beatle record. I love that I Want to Hold Your Hand, that She Loves You. All those great singles were on Beatle albums. I friggin' love that. I didn't need those relegated to 45s only. You know, of course, we bought 45s to begin with because of budget, but that year we all got those Beatle records for the most part. Of course, as I said, the Beatles' second album, Hard Day's Night. Now, this was on United Artists, not Capitol, because they had the rights. Walter Shenson, who produces, was pretty savvy that they got the soundtrack. And, of course, it had the hits, the songs from the picture, from the motion picture, plus George Martin instrumental, like This Boy's Ringo theme. And I love the jazzy kind of mod-ish jazzy Beatle versions on this that George Martin's orchestra put together. Something new they finally got, Capitol finally got some songs retained from A Hard Day's Night from United Artists, and they were able to put it on here, of course, with the German She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, Gib mir dein Hand, and Sie liebt dich. And of course, Beatles 65. Now, this is a special record for me. Came out December 1964 when I got my first stereo, my in-room stereo. It was like a Magnavox, flipped out speakers, pulled down turntable. My parents got tired of me playing the records in the living room, my dad's console. So I got this record on that stereo. And the sound of this record, I love No Reply and I'm a Loser, those opening tracks, of course. The equivalent would be Beatles for Sale, but this is the fantastic record with those great photographs by Robert Whittaker, who would do, obviously, the infamous Butcher cover record. This didn't come out until 1965, but it really covered all those songs that were originally on VJ. All those rights to VJ went back and reverted to the Beatles, to Capitol Records, actually. And VJ basically lost all rights. That's why you're not going to get anything on VJ. You shouldn't get anything on VJ. If you're a collector, get those VJ records, get those Capitol records. A lot of us collectors growing up would buy all the versions of these records, the mono, the stereo, different pressings, different cover variations slightly. Beatle collecting in America is a big thing to this day. If you look up there, that whole box there are all Capitol records from the 1960s. And remember, these records were in print all the way up until 1987. So for a good 25 years, because they were available probably till around 1990 in stores. In the catalog, you could still order them. I mean, the stores could order from the Capitol catalog until the CD era happened in 1987 when the Beatles first started putting out those compact discs of the proper Beatle Parlophone records and Apple records, especially the Parlophone records by that point. Capitol finally switched over all their records. And I went through a period in the late 80s, and I went through and bought all the American albums. You can see here, I worked at the record factory. By this point, I wasn't working there anymore, but I had connections. So for $4.98 each, plus my discount, so I probably paid $3 a piece for these. I have a complete set of sealed American versions. These are in stereo of these records, and I love these records. Now, there were some that were issued with the purple label in the 80s that actually sound fantastic. There were some that were cut by Wally Troggett at Capitol Records. They sound fantastic. I am tentatively interested in how these will sound. I don't think they're going to sound great. Now, we talk about master tapes. Now, master tapes at Capitol means second, third, fourth generation tapes in some cases. The tapes were cut up, put together by Dave Dexter and company to make these collections. They were used over the years. What is interesting, you're going to see the tape boxes, which is kind of great. We love that. And also, you're going to get Bruce Spicer, who wrote the liner notes to each album. Now, Bruce has written a series of amazing collectible books about, this is the birth of Beatlemania in America. It goes through all of the Capitol records. And if you want to know anything, you can download this. I believe these are long out of print. And they go for some big money now. But I have all these books, and he has one on VJ Records. There's the Parlophone Records. There's Apple Records. It's a great archival volume, discography of the records and what the labels were doing, with memos from Capitol Records, just everything that was happening at the time. So he's taking probably from these books and adding it to this series of records. Now, in terms of the box set, another thing, let me show you this. 1974, I was working in a record store, and the Beatles were always celebrated. 4 years after the Beatles split up, Capitol Records had a huge, massive 10-year anniversary. There was this T-shirt that became an iconic T-shirt, the Beatles 10, 1964 to 1974. This is the catalog card. I have one for each artist that each solo artist as well, and it had the listing and the catalog number that were the Capitol records at the time. So, 4 years after the Beatles split up, Capitol in America was still pushing and selling those Beatle records. Of course, I would get variations if they came out, different labels. But for me, by 1967, 68, I think it was early 68 is when I first got, or late 67, I got Sgt. Pepper, a UK version of it. But in 68, I actually started getting all the imports. Tower Records had opened in San Francisco in 1968. There was a store called Gramophone Records in San Francisco on Polk Street, and they imported records. So I was able to get Coleman and I separately. We didn't know each other. Would go to Gramophone and buy the Beatle records, the UK versions of the Beatle records. So as early as I'd say 68, I started collecting the entire Beatle catalog. And there is a bit of a sense memory. To this day, even though now it's been, a good 40 plus years for me knowing, more than that, 45 years, me knowing those British editions, you hear what the next song's going to be in relation to the American editions, because those came out at a time when you're young and you're impressionable. You remember you hear that next note in your brain. It goes through your head and you know what's next. And, there is a certain emotional set about those Beatle records. I didn't mind the reverb. I didn't mind the compression that Dave Dexter put on them. I didn't even know about that. I didn't think about that. These were just great rock and roll records. Listen to the Elvis records. Listen to rock and roll, Gene Vincent and Little Richard and Chuck Berry, and there's a certain tightness to radio, AM radio, and that's what we were used to. It wasn't about audiophile things, and I don't expect these to be audiophile, even though they're promoting them, and Capitol, Universal is promoting them as these all analog thing. I kind of have a little bespoke smirk in me about that, because this guy Kevin Reeves, I think his name is doing these. Now, tell me if I'm wrong here. Now, I've read in the forums people talking about he's the one that did these Verve Jazz series that aren't that good. If is he the guy that did the 2 Jellyfish records last year? I'm thinking that's him. And if that is, I'm even more scared because those were done all analog and they fucked them up. Those 2 Jellyfish records are the worst reissues. I was so excited about those. They were put out about a decade ago from Omnivore, which actually are pretty good. And but for whatever reason, they got screwed up. And apparently there's an issue with the tapes. And the guy who worked on the digital even said so. So if that's the same guy, I'm cautiously optimistic or cautiously negative or very negative. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. So there's not much else I can say about this, but I wanted to say something because I have all these variations of the Beatles' Capitol records. Those of us who grew up, I'm that generation. I'm the first generation of Beatlemania. And some will say, well, why don't they include that record or this record? Again, I'm getting so choked up just talking about this. It's because these are the records from 1964. Yes, some of the songs were from 63. One of the records on Capitol came out in 65, but it's songs from 63, 64. These really make a difference. This is the 60th anniversary of Beatlemania in America. And, you know, the Beatles ruled the world after this. After that, you know, February 7th, Pan Am Flight 101, and then the February 9th Ed Sullivan show. And of course, 3 weeks in a row, they would be broadcast on Ed Sullivan, taped in Miami. The world changed musically, and the Beatles changed it. And it changed my life and a lot of people my age completely. This box set, if you don't know it, you're sleeping under a rock because there's so many videos on here. And I'm not going to tell anything new that I'm sure those videos and those, in some cases, more knowledgeable people about details. I'm talking about the emotional side of me. This is going to be, what, $29.95 in America, these records, which I think is actually a pretty decent price. They look like they're pressed well. There's a blue Target exclusive of Meet the Beatles. The weird thing about it is, of course, this is a documentary record. It's got some interviews, but it's really a documentary record. It started in Liverpool, England. It started in Liverpool, England. That's literally how this record starts out. But we played this record. We enjoyed this record when we were 10 years old. The collective we again. When I was 10 years old, my buddies and I loved playing this record. We didn't know anything about it. There wasn't the internet. There weren't any books. There was a Billy Shepherd book that came out. The Hunter Davis book came out a few years later. That was not till 68 probably. You know, so there, aside from the teen magazines, we would eat up anything about the Beatles. So you got produced by Gary Usher and Robert Christian here, and you got special material written by John Babcock, and you have the Holly Ridge Strings. You know those Holly Ridge Strings instrumental Beatle records? That's most of the music on there. There's one live track, Twist and Shout, that kind of fades in, and these interviews of crazy girls screaming and stuff. But this tells the story. This tells the story. Nothing else told the story. I realized I don't even have a mono version, so I have to get the box. But it's weird. $29.99 a piece or $29.98 a piece. So $180 if you buy them individually. To get this, you have to get this double album in the box for another $120 more. What the fuck? Talk about bad economics. I am getting it, and I think a lot of people who are Beatle collectors will get that. But it's kind of a big tease. I mean, I could see if it was maybe, $30 more, $40 more tops. 120 is excessive. So I'm talking to you, Universal, whoever made that decision. Really a bad decision on that. You want to get some kind of value when you get a box and and there's not even a booklet. I don't think you need a booklet here because you got those essays here. But that's the American Beatles, and Capitol Records, for all their faults, and there were definitely faults, and, they turned down the Beatles, and VJ picked them up, and then Swan, and that, all the stuff that happened. Who knew, right? Decca turned them down in the UK. Who knew? Capitol turned them down here until they didn't. And then they rush release I Want to Hold Your Hand the end of 63, and it becomes a massive hit. That's what sucked me in, I Want to Hold Your Hand. So thanks for watching The Beatles in America on Capitol Records. Yet another video, but this is sort of me warming back into making some videos as I recover from this horrible flu I had in the last week. Thanks for watching. Mazzy loves you.